The chamber goes silent the moment I raise my hand. Not a polite silence, a cruel one, the kind that comes right before someone expects to watch a fool make a mistake in public. I am Daniel Hart, Ambassador of Earth to the Galactic Council, and I am about to end 40 years of service in exactly 6 seconds. The delegate from Earth wishes to vote against the reallocation, says the speaker, a tall Corveni official with silver skin and eyes like wet stone. He says it the way you might announce that a child wants dessert before dinner, amused, indulgent, certain it changes nothing. I am not voting against the reallocation, I say. My voice does not shake. I have practiced this moment in my head for 3 months, ever since I first suspected it was coming. I am voting to withdraw the Human Assembly from the Galactic Council, effective immediately, in full. For a moment, nobody moves. Then someone laughs. I do not turn to see who. It does not matter. In a few months, it will not be funny anymore. Let me back up, because you deserve to understand how we got here. 40 years ago, a small ship carrying 3 explorers from a race called the Vantari drifted into our solar system with a broken engine and a crew slowly running out of air. We found them before anyone else did. We fixed their ship. We fed them. We asked for nothing in return except the truth about who else was out there. That single act of decency opened the door to the wider galaxy. Within 5 years, humanity had a seat at the council table, the newest and smallest voice in a room built for species far older than us. We were grateful. We were proud. We worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove we belonged. They called us Tier 3. Officially, it was a technology classification, based on things like faster-than-light engine efficiency and energy output per capita. Unofficially, everyone understood what it really meant. Useful, cheap, temporary. For 4 decades, human soldiers stood on the front lines of conflicts that were not ours, because our lifespans were considered short enough that our losses did not weigh as heavily on council math. Human doctors were sent into disease outbreaks that other species avoided because our immune systems adapted quickly and our researchers worked fast under pressure. Human pilots flew supply routes through debris fields and gravity storms that other species called impossible, because it turned out that whatever it is that makes a person keep going when the odds are bad, we had more of it than anyone expected. We were never thanked properly. We were used efficiently, and then quietly filed away as expendable. I watched it happen for 40 years, first as a junior aide carrying reports nobody wanted to write, and eventually as the ambassador himself, the man who had to smile through insults dressed up as policy. Today, the insult finally had a shape I could not smile through. The vote on the table was simple in its wording and devastating in its intent. The Council wanted to seize humanity's remaining unclaimed territory at the edge of our own solar system, 3 unnamed moons, and a scattering of asteroid fields we had been slowly surveying for future settlement. Their justification was that Earth's technological contribution to the Council no longer justified our claim to unused space, and that more advanced species could put it to better use. Never mind that human engineers had designed half the shipping lanes the Council depended on. Never mind that human field medics had personally treated members of 11 different species during 3 separate plagues, using techniques nobody else had thought to try. Never mind that when 2 rival factions on the Council's border needed a neutral party both sides could trust to mediate a ceasefire, they always asked for a human, because somehow we had built a reputation for fairness that older, wealthier species had never managed to earn. None of that mattered today. Today, the numbers on a spreadsheet said we were worth less than the empty space around our own sun, and the Council had voted to take it. I could have fought it through the proper channels. I could have filed appeals, called witnesses, spent another decade grinding through committee reviews while our credibility slowly bled out. I had done all of that before, more times than I could count, and I had learned exactly how far it got us. Nowhere. The system was never going to change from the inside, because the people benefiting from it were the ones who controlled the inside. So instead, I did something nobody in that chamber expected. I stopped playing. You cannot simply withdraw, the speaker says, and for the first time, the amusement in his voice has a small crack in it. Membership carries obligations. Trade agreements, defense treaties, joint operations across 6 sectors. You cannot undo 4 decades of integration with a single sentence. Watch us, I say. I want to tell you that the room erupted into chaos, but it did not. Galactic politics rarely works that fast. Instead, there was a long stretch of confused muttering, delegates leaning toward each other, translators working overtime to make sure the words had been understood correctly. Nobody believed it yet. Why would they? For 40 years, humanity had done nothing but ask to stay, to belong, to be accepted. The idea that we might choose to leave, entirely on our own terms, simply did not fit the story they had built about us. The Vantari delegate, an old friend named Kessa Rill, catches my eye from across the chamber. Her species communicates emotion through subtle shifts in the pattern of ridges along their jaw, and I have known her long enough to read the alarm written there now. She does not say anything. She does not need to. Her eyes ask the question everyone else is too proud to ask out loud. Are you serious? I hold her gaze and give the smallest nod I can manage. The speaker calls for a formal record of the vote, still convinced this is theater, still convinced that once the shock wears off, I will quietly walk it back, the way ambassadors always do when they realize how much leverage they have just given away. He does not understand yet that I am not bluffing, because bluffing requires wanting something from the other side. I do not want anything from this room anymore. I want to leave it. The vote is recorded. Under Council law, a founding member species retains an unconditional right of withdrawal. Written into the original charter as a safeguard nobody ever expected a newer species to actually use. It exists because the oldest members wanted to reassure each other that no one would be trapped in the alliance against their will. They never imagined that clause would be pointed at them by the very species they considered the least likely to walk away. This is a mistake, the speaker says, and now the crack in his voice has widened into something closer to concern. Earth depends on Council trade routes for 18% of its resource imports. Your defense arrangements protect 3 of your outer colonies from raider activity. We built those trade routes, I say quietly. We can build new ones. And as for defense, we have been defending your borders for 40 years while being told we were not advanced enough to deserve full protection ourselves. We will take our chances. I look around the chamber one last time. I see delegates from 30 different worlds, some curious, some annoyed, most simply confused, still waiting for the punchline of a joke that is never coming. I think about every human who served and died on a mission that was never truly ours to fight. I think about every doctor who spent sleepless nights saving lives on worlds that never once said thank you. I think about every pilot who flew through storms that should have killed them, because someone decided our lives were worth less than the cargo we carried. Then I think about my daughter, waiting for me back on Earth, asking me every time I came home from these sessions whether the Council had finally started treating us like equals. I never had a good answer for her. Today, I finally do. Effective immediately, I say, the Human Assembly withdraws all personnel, resources, and cooperation from the Galactic Council and its associated operations. Every human currently serving in a council capacity will be recalled within the week. Every trade agreement is terminated. Every shared technology license is revoked. We are going home. The speaker opens his mouth to respond, but I am already turning away from the podium. There is nothing left to say to a room that spent 40 years deciding we were not worth listening to. Behind me, I hear the muttering rise into something louder, delegates finally beginning to understand that this is not theater, that the numbers on their own reports are about to change in ways none of them have planned for. I walk out through the tall doors of the council chamber for the last time, past guards who do not know yet that they will never see another human ambassador stand at that podium again. The corridor outside is quiet, lit by pale blue light strips that hum faintly overhead. I have walked this hallway 10,000 times. I know every scuff mark on the floor, every dent in the wall where careless cargo carts clipped the corners over the decades. I do not look back. Somewhere behind those closed doors, 30 species are still arguing about whether what just happened was real. They think this is a negotiating tactic, a dramatic gesture designed to win us better terms before we inevitably crawl back and beg for our seat at the table again. They have no idea that we are not coming back to beg for anything. They built a galaxy that ran, quietly and invisibly, on human effort, and they never once thought to ask what would happen if that effort simply stopped. They are about to find out. Outside the chamber, my communicator buzzes. It is a message from home, a short line from my daughter asking if I am on my way back yet. I type a simple reply, yes, coming home, for good this time. I mean every word of it. Because somewhere in the endless stretch of stars behind me, the machinery that has run on human hands for 40 years is about to grind to a halt, and there is nobody left who remembers how to run it without us. The door to my transport slides open with a soft hiss. I step inside, sit down, and for the first time in 4 decades, I allow myself to smile. We are finally going home. The transport pulls away from the docking ring with none of the ceremony that once marked every human departure from Council space. There are no honor guards, no formal announcements, no polite applause from delegates pretending to respect a species they privately dismissed. There is only the quiet hum of engines and the slow, deliberate distance growing between myself and 40 years of my life. I do not feel sadness. I expected to. Instead, I feel something closer to relief, the kind that comes after setting down a weight you had carried for so long you forgot it was heavy. Through the viewport, the Council's central station shrinks behind us, a sprawling ring of metal and light built by 1,000 hands from 100 worlds, humans among them, though you would never know it from the official records. We built parts of that station. We repaired its power grid twice. We designed the docking systems that let ships from a dozen incompatible technologies use the same ports safely. None of it ever earned us more than a polite nod and a lower ranking on someone else's spreadsheet. I lean back in my seat and let myself think, really think, about everything that is about to change. Word will spread fast. It always does in a galaxy this connected. By the time I reach the outer relay stations, every Council world will know that Earth has withdrawn. Some will assume it is a bluff. Others will assume we have gone mad. A few, the ones who actually paid attention over the years, will understand exactly what it means, and they will be the first ones to panic. Because here is the truth, nobody in that chamber wanted to admit out loud. Humanity was never just another member species contributing modest resources to a larger whole. We had quietly become the connective tissue holding half the Council's operations together, and nobody bothered to notice because the work we did was never glamorous enough to draw attention. We are about to find out exactly how much that mattered. The recall order goes out before I even reach the first relay station. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Grace Whitfield, has been managing the logistics from Earth for the past 3 months. Ever since I first told her privately what I intended to do. She does not waste time on shock or disbelief. She simply starts working, and within hours, a signal reaches every human serving anywhere in Council space, ordering an immediate and total withdrawal. It is a strange thing, pulling an entire species back from a galaxy at once. There is no single switch to flip. There are thousands of individual departures, each one a small story of its own, and over the following days, I hear about many of them. There is Ethan Brooks, a field medic stationed on a border world called Ossinar Prime, in the middle of treating a respiratory outbreak that has been slowly working its way through 3 connected settlements. He receives the recall order in the middle of a night shift, standing over a patient whose fever has just begun to break thanks to a treatment he adapted from an old human vaccine formula. He finishes the shift. He hands his notes and his research to the local medical staff, knowing they will not fully understand the science behind it, because it was built on decades of human trial and error that nobody outside Earth ever bothered to study closely. Then he packs a single bag and leaves within the hour, exactly as ordered. There is Laura Fenwick, a transport pilot who has spent 6 years flying supply runs through a stretch of space called the Kestrel Corridor, a field of unstable gravity wells that only human pilots have ever managed to navigate without losing a ship. Non-human pilots tried for years and failed, their more rigid flight systems unable to adapt quickly enough to the constant shifting turbulence. Human intuition, stubbornness, and a willingness to trust gut instinct over pure calculation made the difference. Laura flies her final supply run, delivers her cargo, and then turns her ship back toward home instead of toward the next scheduled route. Nobody replaces her. Nobody can. There is a peacekeeping unit stationed along a tense border between two rival factions who have been one incident away from open conflict for over a decade. The only reason that conflict has not erupted is a small team of human negotiators who somehow manage to keep both sides talking whenever tempers rise, using patience and diplomacy that neither side has ever quite trusted in each other, but has learned to trust in us. That team packs up their post and leaves within the week, and I already know what is likely to happen to that fragile peace once they are gone. Story after story reaches me over the following days, and each one paints the same picture. Humanity was never simply a small, low-ranked member species doing modest work at the edges of a much larger system. We were quietly essential in 100 small ways nobody in power ever chose to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have meant treating us as equals. Before I leave council space entirely, I make one final stop. I want to see Kessa Rill in person, one last time, before the door closes for good. She meets me in a small lounge near the docking ring, the same place we used to share meals during long negotiation sessions over the years. Her jaw ridges are drawn tight with worry, and she does not bother with any of the usual pleasantries. "Tell me this is not real," she says. "It is real," I say. "It has been coming for a long time, Kessa. You know that better than most." She sits down heavily across from me, and for a moment, neither of us speaks. I have known her for almost 20 years, since she was a junior logistics officer helping coordinate supply routes during a difficult period when 3 different species were competing for the same limited resources. We built something rare between us, a genuine friendship across an enormous gap in biology and culture, forged through long hours of shared frustration with a system neither of us fully controlled. "The Council does not understand what they are losing," she says finally. "I have tried to explain it in private meetings for years. Nobody listens. They see the classification tables, the technology rankings, and they assume that is the whole picture. They do not see the things you cannot measure on a spreadsheet." "They will see it soon enough," I say. "Whether they understand it in time is a different question." She looks at me for a long moment, and something in her expression softens. "What will happen to us? To the ones who worked alongside you, who valued you, who never agreed with how the Council treated your people?" It is a fair question, and I do not have an easy answer. I do not know, I admit. This is not about punishing everyone who was kind to us. It is about refusing to keep giving everything we have to people who never gave anything back in return. If the Council changes, truly changes, maybe there is a future where we work together again. But that has to come from them now. We have spent 40 years reaching out. It is their turn. She nods slowly, though I can tell it does not fully satisfy her. "I will miss working with you, Daniel. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that." "I will miss it too," I say, and I mean it. Not every relationship we built in that galaxy was corrupted by the Council's arrogance. Some of them were real, and losing those connections is the one part of this decision that genuinely aches. We say our goodbyes, and I do not know if I will ever see her again. It is a strange kind of grief, mourning a friendship that is not actually ending, only becoming distant in a way neither of us chose. The final leg of the journey home takes several days, long enough for the news to spread across every corner of Council space. By the time my transport crosses back into human territory, the reports coming in describe a Council still largely in denial, treating the withdrawal as a temporary tantrum rather than a permanent decision. Some delegates are publicly mocking the idea that humanity could survive without Council trade and protection. Others are quietly beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about exactly how much of their own infrastructure depended on human labor and expertise. When I finally arrive back on Earth, the difference is immediate and overwhelming. The landing platform outside the capital is crowded, not with dignitaries or cameras, but with ordinary people who have gathered simply because they heard the ambassador was coming home for good. My daughter is standing near the front of the crowd, and the moment I step off the transport, she runs to meet me without waiting for any formal procession to finish. "Is it really over?" she asks, her arms wrapped tightly around me. "Are you really staying this time?" "It's over," I say. "We're not going back." Around us, I can hear murmurs rippling through the crowd, disbelief slowly turning into something else. Pride, maybe, or simple relief, the kind that comes when a long, quiet exhaustion finally has permission to end. Over the following weeks, ships continue arriving from every direction, bringing home soldiers, doctors, pilots, engineers, and diplomats who spent years, sometimes decades, serving a council that never once treated them as equals. Families reunite on landing platforms across the planet. Communities that had grown used to sending their best and brightest off into a galaxy that rarely sent them back whole finally get to welcome everyone home in one piece. There is an odd energy in the air during those weeks, a mixture of celebration and uncertainty. Nobody quite knows what comes next. For 40 years, Earth's foreign policy revolved almost entirely around proving ourselves worthy of Council membership. Now that structure is simply gone, and an entire species has to figure out, together, what it means to stand fully on our own for the first time since we learned we were not alone in the universe. I spend those weeks working with Grace and a small team of advisors, mapping out what our economy and defense systems will need to look like without Council trade routes and shared technology licenses. It is not an easy transition. There are real challenges ahead, resources we will need to source differently, technologies we will need to develop independently rather than relying on shared Council research. But for the first time in decades, every decision we make is entirely our own, made by us, for us, without needing anyone else's approval first. On a quiet evening, about a month after my return, I stand on the balcony of my home and look up at the night sky, the same stars that once seemed so full of promise when we first made contact with the Vantari all those years ago. Somewhere out there, in a chamber full of delegates who spent decades underestimating us, the true cost of that decision is only beginning to surface. I do not know yet how bad it will get for them. I only know that we are no longer the ones who have to worry about it. The final transport gate, connecting Earth to Council space, closes formally 3 days later, a quiet administrative act, completed without ceremony, without announcement, without a single delegate present to mark the moment. One day, the gate is simply active, humming with the routine traffic of an interconnected galaxy. The next, it is dark, and the silence on the other side stretches out further than anyone in that chamber could have imagined. 6 months pass before the first real cracks begin to show, and I learn about most of them the way everyone else on Earth does, through fragments that filter back to us via old contacts, independent traders, and the handful of neutral relay stations still willing to pass along information across the closed border. I have been given a strange new title since returning home, one nobody quite explained to me at first: Ambassador Emeritus. It sounds like a polite way of saying retired, but in practice, it means I am the person people come to whenever something happens on the other side of that closed gate that needs careful interpretation. So I listen. I read every report. I pieced together the picture nobody in that chamber wanted to admit was coming. The first serious sign of trouble comes from a mining colony on the edge of what used to be neutral council territory, a place called Varen Station. For years, that colony depended on a rotating team of human engineers to maintain a complex ventilation and structural support system built into unstable rock formations. Human engineers designed the original system, and more importantly, human engineers understood how to adapt it on the fly when conditions shifted, something the automated systems left behind were never fully capable of doing on their own. 3 months after the withdrawal, a structural failure collapses 2 mining tunnels at Varen Station. Nobody is seriously hurt, thankfully, but the colony loses access to nearly a third of its production capacity, and local engineers spend weeks trying to reverse engineer solutions that human teams use to handle as routine maintenance. The reports that reach me describe confused, frustrated technicians working from incomplete notes, trying to recreate expertise that was never fully documented because for years nobody thought to ask the humans to write everything down. Why would they, when the humans were always simply there to handle it? Around the same time, word reaches me about the border conflict I had worried about before I left, the one kept stable for over a decade by a small team of human negotiators. Within 2 months of their departure, tensions along that border escalate sharply. Without a neutral party both sides trust equally, old grievances resurface faster than anyone expected. Skirmishes break out. Trade across the border stops entirely. The fragile peace we spent years helping maintain unravels in a fraction of the time it took to build. I feel the weight of that news more than almost anything else. It is easy to feel a grim satisfaction watching mining operations struggle without our engineers. It is much harder to feel anything but sadness watching a piece we helped build collapse because nobody else was willing or able to do the quiet, patient work required to hold it together. Then there is the outbreak. A viral illness begins spreading through a cluster of worlds near what used to be a major human medical outpost. It is not the first outbreak that region has faced. Human medical teams handled 2 similar situations over the previous decade, developing treatments quickly by drawing on techniques and research methods that other species had never fully adopted, because human medicine had a long history of adapting fast under pressure, born from a world with far more disease diversity than most council species had ever needed to survive. Without human researchers on site, the response is slower, less coordinated, and far less effective. Reports describe overwhelmed medical facilities, treatments developed too late to prevent significant suffering, and a death toll higher than it needed to be. I read those reports late at night, alone in my study, and I feel something complicated twist in my chest. I do not regret the decision to withdraw. I still believe it was the only path left that preserved our dignity as a species. But I never wanted anyone to suffer because of it, and knowing that some of that suffering could have been prevented if the Council had simply treated us fairly from the beginning is a difficult weight to carry. I share these reports with Grace, and together we discuss whether there is anything Earth can, or should, do. It is a genuinely difficult question, one that divides opinion even among our own leadership. Some argue that offering help now, even quietly and unofficially, undermines the entire point of the withdrawal, suggesting to the Council that they can still count on us to clean up their messes without ever having to change how they treat us. Others argue that letting people suffer to prove a political point is its own kind of moral failure, no better than what the Council did to us for 40 years. In the end, Earth makes a careful decision. We will not send official aid or personnel back into Council space, but we quietly authorize independent humanitarian organizations to offer limited medical guidance through neutral channels, not as representatives of Earth, but as private individuals acting on their own conscience. It is not a full retreat from our position. It is a recognition that there is a difference between refusing to be exploited and refusing to be human. Meanwhile, the political situation within the Council grows increasingly strained. I begin receiving quiet, unofficial messages from old contacts, people I worked alongside for years, who never held any particular power, but who understood the mechanics of the system better than most delegates ever bothered to learn. They describe a council in denial publicly and in chaos privately. Publicly, the council's official communications frame the withdrawal as a positive development, describing it as humanity finally embracing the isolation it apparently always wanted, framing our departure as evidence of our own limitations rather than a response to their failures. It is a familiar tactic, one I recognized instantly from decades of watching the council manage its public image. Never admit fault. Always find a way to make the other side look unreasonable. Privately, though, the picture is very different. Committees that once ran smoothly under quiet human coordination now struggle to function at all. Logistics networks designed and maintained largely by human engineers begin experiencing delays and breakdowns that ripple outward across multiple sectors. Diplomatic missions that once relied on human mediators to diffuse tension between rival factions find themselves without anyone trusted enough by all sides to fill that role. One message, from a mid-level administrator named Orsa Tevin, who I worked with for years on trade logistics, describes the situation with unusual honesty. She writes that entire departments within the council bureaucracy have quietly begun trying to recruit individual humans directly, bypassing official government channels entirely, offering private contracts and generous compensation to anyone willing to return in an unofficial capacity. It is, in its own strange way, one of the clearest signs yet of exactly how much the council depended on us, and how unwilling they still are to admit it openly. I do not respond to most of these messages. It is not out of spite, though I understand if it looks that way from the outside. It is because I know that any response from me, even an informal one, could be twisted into something political, evidence that Earth is quietly softening its position, when in truth, nothing has changed. We are still waiting for the council to demonstrate, through real action rather than private back-channel pleading, that they understand what went wrong. Some evenings, I do allow myself one exception. Kessa Rill continues to send messages through the neutral relay stations, and unlike the administrators and delegates trying to quietly recruit human talent for their own advantage, her messages are personal rather than strategic. She tells me about the growing frustration among lower-ranked council staff, many of whom worked directly alongside humans for years and always respected the effort we brought to difficult, thankless jobs. She tells me that a quiet but growing number of delegates, mostly from smaller, less powerful member species, are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions in private sessions about whether the council's entire hierarchy needs to be reconsidered, not just in response to Earth's absence, but because our absence has finally revealed problems that existed long before we ever left. They are starting to understand, she writes in one message, that the tier system was never really about technology. It was about power, about which species got to decide who mattered and who did not. Your departure did not create that problem. It only made it impossible to ignore any longer. I read that message several times before finally sending a short reply. Tell them it is not too late to change, but tell them clearly that we are not interested in coming back to fix a system we never had a fair say in building. If they want a different future, they need to build it themselves first, and prove it means something before asking us to be part of it again. She does not respond right away, and I do not expect her to. Some conversations need time to settle before anyone can respond honestly. Back on Earth, life continues to adjust to our new reality. It is not an easy transition, and I would be lying if I claimed otherwise. Without council trade routes, certain resources we once imported easily become harder to source, and our scientists and engineers work overtime developing independent alternatives. Some of that work is frustrating and slow. Some of it produces genuine breakthroughs, innovations we might never have pursued if we had continued relying on shared council technology instead of building our own solutions from the ground up. Grace leads a new initiative focused on strengthening trade relationships with a handful of smaller species who were never full council members to begin with. Independent civilizations who existed on the margins of council space, largely ignored by the larger powers because they lacked the technological rankings the council valued so highly. These smaller species, it turns out, are eager to work with us. They understand, better than most, what it feels like to be dismissed and undervalued by a system built to favor only the most powerful players. One evening, Grace brings me a report about a small trade delegation from a species called the Meridian Concord, an independent alliance of 3 worlds that has spent decades quietly building sustainable technology and agricultural systems without ever seeking council membership. They reach out to Earth directly, proposing a trade partnership built on equal terms from the very beginning, with no tiers, no hierarchy, and no hidden assumptions about who deserves more respect than whom. This could be the start of something important, Grace says, spreading the proposal across the table between us. Not a replacement for what we lost. Something new, something built the right way from the beginning. I look over the details carefully, and for the first time since the withdrawal, I feel something closer to genuine optimism about the future ahead of us. Not relief that the council is struggling, though I will admit there is a certain grim satisfaction in watching a system built on unfairness finally reckon with the consequences of its own choices. Real optimism about the possibility that Earth's place in the wider galaxy does not have to be defined by the terms a single flawed institution once set for us. As the 6th month since our withdrawal comes to a close, I receive one final piece of news that confirms just how far the situation within the Council has deteriorated. A formal internal review, leaked through one of my old contacts, reveals that overall trade efficiency across Council space has dropped by nearly a quarter since humanity's departure. Border stability in 3 separate sectors has measurably declined. At least 2 medical crises that could have been managed more effectively with human involvement instead resulted in significant, preventable suffering. The report does not use the word mistake anywhere in its official language. Institutions like the Council rarely admit fault so directly, even to themselves. But reading between the carefully worded lines, it is impossible to miss the conclusion buried underneath all the careful diplomatic phrasing. Humanity's absence has revealed exactly how much the Council quietly depended on a species they spent 40 years treating as beneath them. I close the report and sit quietly for a long moment, looking out at the Earth sky, thinking about everything that has happened since that vote 6 months ago. We did not leave to punish anyone. We left because staying meant accepting, again and again, that our worth would always be decided by someone else's spreadsheet. Whatever consequences follow from that decision, on their side of the border or on ours, we made the only choice that let us keep our dignity intact. The silence from Council space grows heavier with each passing week, and I have a strong feeling that silence will not last much longer. The request arrives on a quiet morning, delivered not through any official channel, but through a private message routed carefully to avoid public attention. Grace brings it to me herself, her expression unusually serious. "They want to send a delegation," she says, quietly. No formal announcement, no press, no official recognition that this meeting is even happening. They are asking specifically for you. I read the message twice before I fully believe it. It comes from the Speaker's office, the same official who once laughed at the idea that Earth might actually withdraw. The tone is careful, almost painfully so, worded to avoid anything that could be interpreted as an admission of fault. But underneath the careful diplomatic language, the meaning is unmistakable. The Council wants to talk, and they want to do it without anyone finding out just how badly they need this conversation to happen. "What do you think?" Grace asks. I think about the 6 months of reports that have crossed my desk, the collapsed mining tunnels, the reignited border conflict, the outbreak that spread further than it should have, the internal review admitting, in careful bureaucratic language, that things have gotten measurably worse since our departure. I think about Kessa's messages, describing a council slowly cracking under pressure it never expected to face. I think we should hear them out, I say, not because we owe them anything, because how we handle this moment says everything about who we want to be going forward. Earth's leadership debates the decision for several days before finally agreeing to the meeting, with conditions. It will take place on neutral ground, a small independent station operated by a species with no formal council ties, chosen specifically because it belongs to neither side. I will attend as Earth's representative, but I will not attend alone. A small team accompanies me, including Grace, along with 2 representatives from our new trading partners among the smaller independent species, present as observers rather than negotiators, a quiet signal that Earth's future no longer depends solely on whatever the Council decides to offer. When I step off the transport onto the neutral station, I find the Council delegation already waiting. It is a smaller group than I expected, 5 delegates instead of the usual sprawling committee, another sign that this meeting is meant to stay as quiet as possible. Among them, to my genuine surprise, stands Kessa Rill. She meets my eyes across the room, and something passes between us that neither of us needs words to explain. Relief, maybe, or simply the comfort of a familiar face in an unfamiliar, tense situation. The lead delegate is not the speaker himself, which tells me something important before he even speaks. The Council is not ready to have its highest official personally acknowledge how badly things have gone. Instead, they have sent a senior administrator named Vos Kale, an older Corveni official known for his careful, measured approach to difficult negotiations. "Ambassador Hart," he says, extending a formal greeting. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." "Emeritus," I correct gently. "I no longer hold an official diplomatic title. I am here as a private citizen, representing the interests of Earth at the request of my government." It is a small distinction, but an important one. I want them to understand from the very first moment that this is not a return to old patterns. I am not here as a supplicant seeking readmission. I am here because Earth chose, deliberately and on its own terms, to listen to what they have to say. Vos Kale nods slowly, absorbing the correction. "Of course, we appreciate you making the time regardless." We settle into a private meeting room, the kind designed for sensitive negotiations, with no recording devices and no outside observers beyond the small group each side has brought along. For a long moment, nobody speaks. I let the silence stretch, unwilling to make this easier for them than it needs to be. Finally, Vos Kale begins. "The Council has conducted an extensive internal review over the past several months. I will not pretend the findings have been comfortable. We have identified significant operational difficulties across multiple sectors, difficulties that correlate directly with the withdrawal of human personnel and expertise. I have seen the report," I say quietly, "or at least portions of it." He pauses, clearly unsettled by that admission, though he recovers quickly. "Then you understand the scale of the situation. We are prepared to discuss terms for reinstating Earth's membership within the Council, under a revised classification that better reflects your species' actual contributions." There it is. The offer I expected, delivered exactly the way I expected it to be delivered, framed as generosity rather than correction. A revised classification, not full equality, simply a slightly better position within the same broken hierarchy that caused this problem in the first place. "No," I say. The room goes still. I can see the surprise ripple across the delegation's faces, even Kessa's, though hers carries something closer to quiet hope rather than shock. "I am not interested in a revised classification," I continue. "I am not interested in any system that still ranks species by tiers, that still decides in advance whose contributions matter more than others based on arbitrary technological metrics. Earth did not withdraw because we wanted a better number next to our name. We withdrew because the entire structure treats respect as something to be earned incrementally, rather than something owed to every member from the beginning. Voss Kale exchanges a glance with the other delegates before responding carefully. The tier system has existed since the Council's founding. It provides structure, a way to organize responsibilities and privileges fairly across member species of vastly different capabilities. It provides a way to justify treating some species as less important than others, I say. Call it structure if that makes it easier to accept. I call it what it actually is. Another long silence follows. I let it sit, unwilling to fill the space with reassurance, the way old diplomatic habits might once have encouraged me to do. This is not a moment for softening hard truths. Finally, one of the other delegates speaks, a quieter voice I have not heard yet in this meeting, belonging to a young representative from a smaller council species called the Ithri. What would satisfy Earth, then? What terms would bring you back? I have thought about this question for months, ever since the reports of collapsing infrastructure and preventable suffering first began reaching me. I did not want to answer it with anger, though anger would have been easy. I wanted to answer it honestly. Full and equal standing, I say. No tiers, no classification system that ranks species by how useful their technology appears on a chart. Every member species, regardless of size or age or level of technological development, holds an equal voice and equal respect within council proceedings. That is the only version of membership Earth would ever consider again. Voss Kale's expression tightens. That would require restructuring the entire foundation of how the Council operates. Species who have held senior status for centuries would need to accept equal standing with newer, less established members. It is not a small request. No, I agree, it is not. But it is the only request that actually addresses the problem. You did not lose our cooperation because of a bad classification number. You lost it because for 40 years you told us, in 100 quiet ways, that we were worth less than everyone else in that chamber. A better number does not fix that. Only genuine equality does. The meeting stretches on for nearly 2 more hours, moving through familiar patterns I recognize instantly from decades of council negotiations. Careful proposals designed to sound generous while changing as little as possible. Gentle pushback whenever I refuse to soften my position. Repeated appeals to practicality, to tradition, to the difficulty of restructuring something so deeply established. I hold my ground through all of it, and I can see, gradually, that my refusal to compromise is landing differently than the delegation expected. They came prepared to negotiate Earth back down to a slightly improved position within the existing system. They did not come prepared for someone who no longer needs anything the Council has to offer, and therefore has no reason to accept anything less than what fairness actually requires. Near the end of the meeting, Kessa speaks for the first time, addressing not me, but her fellow delegates. I have worked alongside humans for nearly 20 years, she says. I watched them do difficult, thankless work across a dozen different crises, always treated as though their effort mattered less, simply because of an arbitrary number assigned to their species decades ago. Ambassador Hart is not asking for something unreasonable. He is asking the Council to finally practice the values it claims to represent. Voss Kale studies her for a long moment before turning back to me. We cannot promise immediate restructuring on this scale. It would require a formal vote, extensive deliberation, likely significant resistance from several senior member species who benefit from the current hierarchy. I understand that, I say. I am not asking for an answer today. I am telling you clearly what Earth requires before we would ever consider returning. Whether the Council is willing to do the difficult work of actually earning that trust back is entirely up to you. We are not in a hurry. We have spent the last 6 months proving to ourselves that we do not need Council membership to thrive. Every day that passes without genuine change on your side simply confirms that we made the right decision. The meeting ends without a formal agreement, exactly as I expected it would, but as we prepare to leave the station, Voss Kale approaches me one final time, his careful diplomatic composure slipping just slightly. Do you believe it is possible? He asks quietly, a council built on genuine equality rather than hierarchy. I think about the question honestly before answering. I believe it is possible. I do not know if your council is capable of becoming that place. That is not a decision I get to make for you. It is a decision your species, and every other species still sitting in that chamber, will have to make for yourselves. He nods slowly, and for a brief moment, I see something in his expression that looks almost like genuine reflection, rather than practiced diplomatic performance. It is a small thing, but after everything that has happened, small things feel meaningful in a way they never used to. Before boarding my transport home, Kessa pulls me aside one last time. Thank you, she says, for saying what needed to be said, even when it would have been easier to accept a smaller victory. I did not do it for the council, I say. I did it for everyone who spent decades believing a smaller victory was the best we could ever hope for. She smiles, the ridges along her jaw shifting into a pattern I have learned, over the years, means genuine warmth rather than simple politeness. Whatever happens next, I am glad it was you standing in that room today. As my transport pulls away from the neutral station, I find myself thinking, not about anger or vindication, but about possibility. The Council's offer fell far short of what Earth requires, exactly as I expected it would. But something shifted in that room today, a crack in a structure that has stood unquestioned for far longer than humanity has even existed as a spacefaring species. Whether that crack widens into real change or simply closes back over the way cracks in old systems so often do, remains to be seen. Either way, for the first time since this entire situation began, I do not feel like Earth is waiting anxiously for someone else's decision. We are simply watching, patiently, to see whether the rest of the galaxy is finally ready to catch up with a truth we have known about ourselves for a very long time. 3 months after the neutral station meeting, word reaches me that the Council has scheduled a formal vote on Earth's terms. It is not something I learned through official channels, since Earth is no longer a member entitled to direct notification. Instead, Kessa sends word through our usual quiet arrangement, along with a warning that the vote will likely be far messier than the private meeting we shared months earlier. There is real support for change, she writes. More than I expected, honestly. But there is also serious resistance from several of the oldest member species, the ones who have benefited most from the current hierarchy for centuries. Do not expect an easy outcome. I read her message carefully, and I feel none of the anxious hope I once might have felt during my years as ambassador, desperate for any sign of progress. Instead, I feel something calmer, steadier. Earth no longer needs this vote to go a certain way in order to move forward. Whatever the Council decides, we will continue building the future we have already started constructing without them. Still, I follow the proceedings closely when the day finally arrives, receiving updates through Kessa and a handful of other contacts willing to share what is happening inside a chamber I once stood in myself. 40 years of history behind every word spoken there. The vote begins with what I am told is an unusually long and heated debate. Delegates from the Council's oldest and most powerful species argue forcefully against dismantling the tier system entirely, insisting that some form of structured hierarchy remains necessary to manage the vast differences in capability and resources among member species. It is the same argument I heard countless times during my own years in that chamber, dressed up in slightly different language, but carrying the same underlying message. Some species deserve more say than others, and changing that arrangement threatens the stability of the entire system. Other delegates, particularly from smaller and newer member species who have spent decades watching humanity's treatment with quiet discomfort of their own, push back forcefully. Kessa tells me later that several delegates specifically cite the consequences of Earth's absence as undeniable proof that the current system undervalues contributions that do not fit neatly into technological rankings. The debate stretches across 2 full days, an unusually long session even by the Council's notoriously slow standards. When the vote finally happens, the result is not the clean, decisive outcome either side hoped for. The Council agrees, by a narrow margin, to begin a formal process of restructuring the tier system, but the specific terms remain vague, deliberately so, leaving room for the oldest and most powerful species to slow-walk the changes over an extended, undefined timeline. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of half-measure I expected from an institution that has spent centuries perfecting the art of appearing to change while actually changing very little. I received the official summary of the vote's outcome through Kessa, delivered with an apology in her tone, even though none of this is her fault. "It is not everything you asked for," she writes. "I know that, but it is more than the Council has ever conceded before. Some delegates are already trying to slow the process down before it truly begins. I do not know how quickly, or how fully, real change will actually happen." I sit with that message for a long time before responding. Earth's leadership gathers to discuss the outcome, weighing whether this represents enough progress to warrant any kind of renewed engagement with the Council, even informally. In the end, our answer is simple and unanimous. It is not enough. I draft a formal response, the first official communication Earth has sent to the Council since the day I walked out of that chamber. It is brief, deliberately so, and it does not soften the message in the diplomatic language I once might have used out of habit. Earth acknowledges the Council's decision to begin restructuring its classification system. The message reads, "We recognize this as a meaningful first step." However, a vague commitment to eventual change, without clear timelines or enforceable standards, does not meet the terms Earth requires for renewed engagement. We remain willing to build a relationship with the Council, but only once genuine, verifiable equality has been fully established, not promised. Until then, Earth will continue building its future independently, alongside partners who have already demonstrated that equal respect does not require centuries of deliberation to achieve. The response is not intended as an insult, though I suspect several delegates will interpret it that way. It is intended as an honest reflection of where things genuinely stand. The Council took a first step, a real one, larger than anything they managed during the 40 years we spent as members hoping quietly for exactly this kind of change. But a first step is not the same as arrival, and Earth has learned, through hard experience, not to mistake the beginning of a promise for the fulfillment of one. In the months that follow, something unexpected begins to happen, something I did not fully anticipate when I first cast that vote to withdraw so long ago. Word of Earth's departure, and the Council's subsequent struggles, spreads well beyond the borders of Council space itself. Independent species who were never part of the Council to begin with, along with several smaller member species who have grown increasingly frustrated with their own treatment under the tier system, begin reaching out to Earth directly, curious about how we managed to walk away from an institution most of them assumed held total, unquestionable power over its members. Grace leads several of these new conversations personally, and I join a handful of them myself, sharing honestly what our withdrawal cost us and what it gave us in return. We do not encourage anyone to make hasty decisions. Leaving an institution you have depended on for generations is not a choice to make lightly, and I make sure every species we speak with understands the real challenges we faced during our own transition. But the conversations continue regardless, and slowly, quietly, a new pattern begins to emerge across the wider galaxy. A handful of smaller Council species, emboldened by watching Earth survive and even thrive outside the Council's control, begin raising formal objections of their own, demanding changes to a system they too have long felt undervalued them. Two smaller species, encouraged by both Earth's example and the Council's visible struggles since our departure, formally announced their own withdrawal within the same year, a development that sends a far louder shockwave through the Council chamber than anything a single species leaving on its own ever could. I receive one final message from Kessa nearly a year after the day I cast that first vote. She describes a council chamber that looks noticeably different from the one I once stood in for 40 years. Several senior delegates who once dismissed any possibility of real change have been replaced by newer representatives more willing to negotiate seriously. The restructuring process, though still slower than many would like, has begun producing actual, measurable results, driven largely by the Council's growing fear that further inaction will cost them even more member species than they have already lost. "It is not finished," she writes. "There is still a long way to go, and still plenty of resistance from those unwilling to give up the advantages they have held for centuries. But it is real progress now, not just promises. I wanted you to know that, whatever role Earth ultimately decides to play in what comes next. I think carefully about how to respond, and eventually I write back something simple and true. Earth is proud of the choice we made, and we do not regret a single part of it, even the difficult parts. If the Council genuinely becomes the kind of place where every species stands as equals, we would be glad to see it, and glad to build something new with the people willing to make that happen. Whether that includes formal Council membership again, or simply an honest partnership between equals outside the old structure entirely, is a conversation for another day. For now, we are simply proud of what we became once we finally stopped waiting for permission to matter. I do not know exactly what the future holds, either for Earth or for the Council we once called home. Institutions built on old habits of hierarchy rarely transform quickly or completely, and I suspect there will be setbacks ahead, moments where old patterns threaten to reassert themselves before real change can fully take root. But something important has already happened, something that cannot be undone regardless of what comes next. For 40 years, humanity waited patiently for a seat at a table built by others, hoping that patience and hard work alone would eventually earn us the respect we deserved. We learned eventually that some tables are never going to offer that respect willingly, no matter how much value we bring to them. Sometimes the only way to be truly seen is to stop asking permission to exist and simply walk away. We did not walk away out of anger, though anger was certainly part of what carried us through that final vote. We walked away because we finally understood our own worth clearly enough to refuse anything less than it deserved. Tonight, standing once again on the same balcony where I stood the night I first came home for good, I look up at a sky full of stars, no longer wondering anxiously what the people behind those distant lights think of us. We know exactly who we are now, independent of anyone else's approval. We built new partnerships on our own terms. We solved problems no one thought we could solve without outside help. We proved, to ourselves most of all, that our worth was never something the Council had the power to grant or take away in the first place. Somewhere out there, a council chamber that once laughed at the idea of humanity walking away is still slowly, painfully, learning what it actually lost that day. Whether they finish learning that lesson in time to build something better, or whether the cracks that started the day we left eventually bring the whole structure down entirely, is no longer a story that belongs to Earth. Our story, the one that matters most now, is the one we are writing for ourselves, one honest partnership at a time, standing exactly as tall as we always deserve to stand. And for the first time in 40 years, nobody gets to tell us otherwise.